The shortest war in history lasted just 38 minutes? Imagine a war so brief, it was over before you could finish your morning coffee. A conflict that began, escalated, and concluded in less time than it takes to watch a single episode of your favorite sitcom. Sounds impossible, right? But it happened. On August 27, 1896, the world witnessed the most ridiculously short war in recorded history, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which lasted a mind-boggling 38 minutes. This wasn't some minor skirmish between two tribes in a remote jungle. This was a formal declaration of war between a global superpower and a small island sultanate. And while the sheer brevity of it is laughably absurd, it's also a stark, almost chilling, snapshot of a very specific, very brutal moment in human history, the age of unchecked colonialism and overwhelming military power. Get ready, because this story is wilder than fiction, and it tells us a lot about how the world used to work, and sometimes, still does. To truly understand how a war could be over before the first commercial break, we need to rewind a little, back to the late 19th century. Picture Zanzibar, a small, vibrant island off the coast of East Africa. Now, today, Zanzibar is famous for its spices, beautiful beaches, and rich history. But back then, it was a crucial hub for trade, a strategic jewel on the Indian Ocean. For centuries, it had been a significant center for the East African slave trade, and later, for commodities like clothes. Though nominally independent, it had strong ties to the Sultanate of Oman for a long time. However, by the late 1800s, like many places around the globe, Zanzibar found itself caught in the colossal game of grab everything you can being played by European powers, particularly Great Britain and Germany. Britain, with its vast empire, saw Zanzibar as absolutely vital. It was a key coaling station for ships traversing the Suez Canal route to India and Australia, and a crucial point for extending British influence into the African interior. They didn't want direct control initially, but they certainly wanted a friendly face in charge. This is where our story truly begins. In 1890, through the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, Britain essentially got Germany to back off, giving Britain a free hand in Zanzibar, which they promptly declared a British protectorate. Now, protectorate sounds nice and cuddly, but in practice, it meant Britain called the shots. They dictated foreign policy, defense, and had a huge say in internal affairs, including who sat on the Sultan's throne. They liked to choose rulers who would be, shall we say, amenable to British interests. And the Sultan at the time, Hamad bin Thuwaini, was exactly that. He was pro-British, played by their rules, and kept things stable and profitable for the empire. Everything was humming along, from Britain's perspective, until August 25, 1896. That's when Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini suddenly and unexpectedly passed away. Now, whenever a leader dies, especially in a region under foreign influence, there's always potential for a succession crisis. And this time, potential exploded into immediate, dramatic reality. Before Hamad's body was even cold, his ambitious cousin, Khalid bin Barghash, made his move. Khalid wasn't exactly a fan of British influence. He saw himself as the rightful heir and, more importantly, as a nationalist who believed Zanzibar should be truly independent, free from British meddling. He gathered his supporters, marched into the palace, and declared himself the new sultan. This was a massive problem for the British. This wasn't how they did things. They had their own preferred candidate, Hamad bin Muhammad, a man known for being much more pliable and cooperative. Khalid's swift, unsanctioned ascension was a direct challenge to British authority, a gauntlet thrown down that simply couldn't be ignored. The British consul and diplomatic agent in Zanzibar at the time was Basil Cave. He quickly understood the gravity of the situation. He recognized Khalid's defiance not just as a local power grab, but as a deliberate snub to British imperial might. His immediate response was to summon Khalid and demand he step down. But Khalid, full of youthful zeal and perhaps a touch of overconfidence, refused. He was convinced he had popular support and that the British wouldn't dare escalate. He was about to learn a very hard lesson about what protectorate truly meant. As Khalid dug in his heels, the British weren't sitting idle. Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, commanding the British naval forces in the region, was quickly informed. He arrived in Zanzibar harbor with a formidable display of power. His squadron included 3 powerful cruisers, HMS Philomel, HMS Rush, and HMS Raccoon, along with 2 gunboats, HMS Thrush and HMS Sparrow, and a contingent of Royal Marines. These weren't just ships, they were floating fortresses, bristling with modern artillery, designed to project British dominance across the globe. On the other side, Khalid was attempting to prepare for the inevitable. He barricaded himself within the Sultan's palace, a grand but ultimately vulnerable structure on the waterfront. He managed to gather a force of approximately 2,800 men. This included the palace guard, armed mostly with rifles, and a significant number of civilians, eager to support their new sultan, perhaps not fully grasping the overwhelming odds they faced. For artillery, Khalid had a few ancient cannons, mostly ceremonial pieces, and tellingly, one armed yacht, the HHS Glasgow, a former royal yacht that was more showpiece than warship. It carried a few obsolete guns and a crew that was barely trained for combat. It was a motley crew, armed with outdated weapons, facing down the might of the world's most powerful navy. The disparity was not just significant, it was galactic. As the sun rose on August 26, tensions were at their peak. Rawson sent a direct ultimatum to Khalid: surrender the palace and relinquish your claim to the throne by 9 a.m. the following morning, August 27. If he didn't, the British would open fire. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a demand, delivered with the implicit threat of total destruction. Khalid, perhaps believing the British were bluffing, or perhaps fueled by a desperate hope that some other power might intervene, Germany had a consulate nearby, but they made it clear they wouldn't get involved, decided to defy the ultimatum. He spent the night preparing, moving his forces, and bolstering his pathetic defenses. He even raised the Sultan's flag over the palace, a symbolic act of defiance. This decision, born of pride or miscalculation, would prove to be catastrophic. As the clock ticked towards 9 a.m. on August 27, 1896, the atmosphere in Zanzibar must have been surreal. The British warships, positioned menacingly close to the shore, had their guns trained directly on the palace. The crews stood ready, awaiting the order. Inside the palace, Khalid and his loyalists braced themselves, perhaps clinging to a prayer or a desperate hope for a miracle. The people of Stone Town, the capital, would have been gripped by fear and anticipation, huddled in their homes, knowing a storm was about to break. At precisely 9 a.m., the British delivered on their promise. A single shell from HMS Raccoon screamed across the harbor, tearing into the palace. It was the signal. The British warships unleashed a furious bombardment. Cannon fire ripped through the air, followed by explosions that shook the very foundations of the old stone palace. The shells were devastating. The ancient, thick walls offered little protection against modern naval artillery. The palace quickly began to crumble, turning into a fiery mess of splintered wood, shattered stone, and suffocating smoke. Khalid's forces, despite their numbers, were completely outmatched. Their antiquated rifles were useless against the armored ships, and their few old cannons couldn't even reach the British vessels, let alone inflict any damage. The one-armed yacht, HHS Glasgow, attempted a pathetic counterattack, bravely but foolishly steaming out to engage the cruisers. It was met with an immediate, overwhelming response from HMS St. George, which sank it within minutes. The Glasgow went down with many of its crew, a tragic and futile act of defiance. The bombardment was relentless. The British weren't just aiming to dislodge Khalid, they were sending an unmistakable message about who was in charge. Shell after shell slammed into the palace, igniting fires, bringing down walls, and creating chaos and destruction. The Sultan's flag, proudly flying over the palace just moments before, was quickly shot down, a definitive symbol of the crushing defeat. It was absolute devastation. The fighting was incredibly one-sided, more of an execution than a battle. The Zanzibar defenses were simply disabled in an instant. The noise, the smoke, the sheer terror of it all must have been unimaginable for those trapped inside the palace. Inside the crumbling palace, Khalid quickly grasped the futility of his resistance. There was no hope. His men were being cut down, his stronghold reduced to rubble. At 9:38 a.m., just 38 minutes after the first shot was fired, the shelling ceased. Khalid, along with his closest advisors, fled the burning ruins of the palace and sought refuge at the nearby German consulate. With the German flag offering a thin veil of diplomatic immunity, the British couldn't immediately seize him. The war was over. In just 38 minutes, the British had achieved their objective. The palace was a smoking wreck, Khalid was on the run, and British authority was unequivocally reasserted. The casualty count perfectly illustrated the lopsided nature of this war. On the British side, there was just a single wounded sailor. Think about that, one minor injury. On the Zanzibar side, the casualties were tragically high, estimated to be around 500 dead or wounded. These were people who had bravely, if misguidedly, stood up against an overwhelming force. They paid the ultimate price for Khalid's defiance and their own sense of national pride. Immediately after the firing ceased, the British installed their preferred candidate, Hamad bin Muhammad, as the new Sultan. He was everything they wanted, agreeable, cooperative, and willing to follow their lead. His reign would cement British control over Zanzibar even further, paving the way for the eventual abolition of slavery on the island, a long-standing British demand. Khalid, after some diplomatic wrangling, was eventually smuggled out of the German consulate by German sailors and taken to German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, where he lived in exile for years. He was eventually captured by the British during World War I and died in Mombasa in 1927. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, despite its absurdly short duration, is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a chillingly effective demonstration of the power dynamics at play during the height of the colonial era. It highlights the stark reminder of the massive technological and military disparities between European colonial powers and the territories they sought to control. It shows the devastating consequences for anyone who dared to resist the European scramble for influence and resources. This 38-minute conflict underscores the swiftness with which European powers, particularly Great Britain, could enforce their will. It wasn't about negotiation or diplomacy when their interests were directly challenged, it was about overwhelming force, deployed with surgical precision and devastating effect. The brevity of the war isn't just a quirky fact, it's a terrifying testament to the absolute military advantage held by an imperial power. It reveals a period where national sovereignty meant very little if you didn't have the cannons to defend it. So, the next time you hear about a major global event, remember this little war. It reminds us that history isn't just about long, drawn-out battles. Sometimes, the most informative, and frankly, shocking, stories are found in the quickest conflicts, battles that lasted less time than it takes to queue for your morning coffee.